Hello there. Today we are in the book of 2 Kings, chapter 2, and we're following the story of Elijah, which, as we're about to find out, is coming to an end. However, he has picked an assistant who is going to take his place eventually. That person's name is Elisha. So, very similar names, but they are two different people. And with this, we are seeing that Elijah knows that he's about to leave Earth. However, apparently he knows that it's not going to be the normal way. The normal way for people to leave Earth is to die, but Elijah realizes that he's going to not die. And this has happened once before with Enoch back in Genesis, and this was a great honor that God gave to Enoch way back then, because Enoch was such a good guy, God went ahead and took him on to heaven. In this case, Elijah has had his struggles, but overall, he's done his best to work for God and be a good prophet for God. And now Elisha is to take his place. Well, it starts off a little bit oddly because Elijah tells Elisha, okay, you stay here, I'm going to this place. And Elisha says, no, I'm coming with you. He does this 3 times. And each of the places Elijah goes is to meet with other prophets who are in those places. And it's almost as if this is a last chance for him to talk to these other prophets and discuss important things with them before he leaves Earth. Because these prophets know that they won't see Elijah again, and they sneak over to Elisha and say, he's about to go away. Well, Elisha knows this, so it's possible that God informed Elisha that this was going to happen and didn't uh, let the others know that he'd told him as well. In any event, um, Elisha goes along every time. He tells these people, yes, yes, I know about this, but let's not talk about it. It would be kind of rude to talk about someone who is about to leave Earth right in front of him or close to him. So that's probably the reason for that. Well, Elijah gets to the Jordan River. He rolls up his cloak and slaps the water, and the water parts, and he walks across on dry land. Of course, Elisha's right there with him, and he crosses over too. And with Elijah leaving, he does something that is often done by people who expect to die or they're preparing to die. And he says, well, what do you want from me? Well, Elisha says, I'd like a double portion of your spirit. And here's where I have to explain a little something. In those days, when someone died, his oldest son would get twice the inheritance of everybody else. And you think, well, okay, is that really fair? Well, the oldest son was expected to take on the burden or the work of the father who has died, and it kind of makes sense that he would have more resources to use for that purpose because he is responsible for the people who are left in the family. So to ask for this, Elisha realizes the position he is in. It's an important position, and so that's okay. But he's not asking for physical things. He's asking for something spiritual. And it sounds as if he wants the Spirit of God in him even that much more strongly than it already is. And that might be a little confusing, but you think of it this way, is that Elijah was able to do some miracles during his time, and maybe Elisha is thinking that he will need that to be able to do his work for God. Well, in any event, Elijah says, well, I don't know if I can do that, but I'll tell you what, when I'm taken away, if you see me, then what you ask for will be given to you. Okay, that seems to satisfy everybody, meaning the two of them. And the next thing we know, chariots with horses show up. But these are not normal chariots and horses. These are on fire but they're not being burned up. And immediately we think, oh, that's right. The same thing happened with Moses at the burning bush. The bush was there and there was fire and it wasn't being burned up, and that meant God was there. Well, these chariots of fire represent God's army, and they will appear again later to Elisha. And he's able to see this, and they take Elijah on there and go off to heaven. Well, Elisha's able to see this, and Elijah throws down his cloak, and Elisha picks it up, and now he's got it. Of course, maybe he's not sure if he has the ability to do miracles that he seems to have asked for. Well, he rolls up the cloak, he goes back to the Jordan River, slaps it, it separates for him. Okay, so we see that he does have some power. Well, he's not going to misuse this, because what we find with Elisha is that he uses the abilities he is given to work for God and do things for people. For instance, oh goodness, there's several stories back to back to back in all of this. And the first one may not seem like a good thing, because what happens is he's walking back near Bethel, where they had just met a bunch of God's prophets. But Bethel is kind of the center of all this worship of these pretend gods. And the people who worship those pretend gods did not like the real God, and they would make fun of God's prophets. And a bunch of boys or young men come out. And when we think of that, we think of, kids, children, that sort of thing. But no, when they talked about young men, that would be anywhere from 12 years old to 30 years old. So these were older boys or young men, and they were making fun of Elisha. And they're telling him, oh, go up, you empty head. Well, there are two things about that. That going up is kind of like what Elijah did in the chariot of fire. And when they say empty head, some people think it meant bald-headed, that they were making fun of Elisha for either shaving his head or being bald. I don't think that's right, because one of the better interpretations of it seems to indicate that they were saying that he didn't have a brain, that he couldn't think, and that he was dumb and all of that. And so essentially, they're insulting God's prophet, and they're insulting God in the manner in which Elijah left the earth. Well, Elisha recognizes this, and he calls down a curse on these young men. And that doesn't mean he used bad words or anything like that. What he was doing was asking God to punish them. And God certainly answers by sending out 2 bears, and the bears light into it. And the way the wording is, it says it tore apart, or the bears tore apart 42 of these guys. So there were likely more guys there. So there was Elisha by himself and all of these guys. And when you get that many people picking on someone, it doesn't take much for them to go after that person and try to kill him. Well, that's probably what they had in mind. But the bears took care of that. Well, if some of those guys were smart, they got out of there before the bears got to them. And with the bears tearing apart 42 of them, that might mean that 42 of them died. It may just mean that they injured them. But whatever ill intention they had for Elisha is gone now. Well, Elisha goes on to this place that has bad water, and they come to him about it, and he says, okay, we need to deal with this. And he really did, for their sake, because the water made people sick when they drank it. In fact, it was so bad that it kept the crops from growing properly when they used that water. So he had them bring him a new bowl and some salt, and he used that to put into the water that was coming out. This was like a spring or natural water coming from the ground. Well, we know scientifically that wouldn't have done anything, but that's not the point in all of this. The point is that he is doing something and using God's power to correct something. And we'll see this again later. There's a pot of food that somebody put these gourds in thinking they were edible, but they really weren't. They were they would end up poisoning people if they ate what was in the stew. And this was serious because there was a famine going on and you didn't want to lose any food. Well, in that case, he had them bring him some flour and sprinkled that into it, and that neutralized the poison in there, and they were able to eat it. And flour in and of itself doesn't do that. So what we see is that the people going to Elisha realize that he's having them do these things out of faith, because the things that they are to do or to bring him are not going to solve the problem. It's their trusting God that is key in all of this. So um, Elisha goes on to, one, help this woman have a child when she had not been able to have a child. And that was one of those cases where she had not been able to have a child, and he gives a blessing from God, and she has a son. Well, later the son dies, and she comes to him, and he's able to go directly to where the child is and helps bring him back to life. So we're starting to see here that, oh, Elisha is doing some things that are greater than even what Elijah did, and things that will not be done again until Jesus comes to the earth. And so as we go through these chapters, and I haven't mentioned all of the things that he did, because there were even things like where some kings asked him for help. And the funny one in that one is that the king of Judah was there, and he was one of the good kings who followed God. And he tells the king of Israel, who's there too, he said, if he weren't with you, I wouldn't help you, because the king of Israel did not follow God. So in all of this, Elisha isn't turning the attention on himself, saying, oh, come to me, I can do all of these things. When he does these things, he's pointing back to God, and he's giving God credit for what he is doing. And that's a valuable lesson for us, so that when we are able to do things for people, we need to be able to credit God for them. So let's say that there's something that you could do for somebody and you don't really want to do it, either because it will be difficult, or it will cost you something, either a lot of time or a lot of materials, but you decide, well, I think God would want me to do this. And you go ahead and do it. If somebody's praising you for helping them, you turn around and give credit to God and say, well, God wanted me to do this, so I'm doing this for you. And that is where I'm going to close today's lesson. With Elisha, the more you read about him, and the part I'm covering is chapters 2, 3, and 4 of 2 Kings. You can go through those and find out, oh, he did something else, and oh, he did this too. And that can kind of boost your confidence to try to do things you can do. You may not have the special power that God gave him, but there are things that you are able to do if you just think about it. Okay, today's tie, this one's a little bit more funny than anything else, but I have a balloon that's rising up, and it has Winnie the Pooh and Tigger on this, and I'm thinking of this as when Elijah left the earth, and that would be Pooh on the balloon. Of course, Tigger would have stayed behind in this case. So, don't think of this as too clearly a reference to the story, but it is one to help remind us of, oh yeah, these two guys worked together for a while. All right, with that, I'm going to let you go, and I hope you'll be back next time. Bye.